Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I'm in the middle of making this quilt. Now, this is just the center of a quilt. It only has borders left to be put on. So it's one big block with some borders. But today I'd like to share with you my little tips and tricks on doing those setting triangles. They're really easy, and you can make those triangles as big as you want and trim them down later. Now, I cannot get this quilt in the camera view, so I'm going to do it miniature sized, but the technique is going to be the same. It doesn't matter what size you make the blocks. In the description, I will put this handout, and it is the quilt that I am making, so it does have my cut sizes, and it's sort of a coloring sheet, so you can color it into the fabric that you want. But it does give you the sizes, so you'll be able to follow along. And the fabric that I'm using today is this beautiful yellow and black fabric from Northcott. It is called Windsong. So let me make a miniature of this, and I'll share with you my triangle settings. This is the quilt that I am making. So that piece that you saw hanging behind me is just that center. So I do still need to add the borders on. And this is what the coloring sheet is going to look like. And these are cut sizes. So you're going to be able to download this, follow along, and color it in with your own fabric choices. And this is that beautiful Windsong fabric that I will be using. The very center of this quilt is just a square block. But when it's put in the quilt, it's on a diagonal. We have the centerpiece and that outside border. The sizes I will give you will be for the large quilt, but I will be making it in the miniature. So the large block in the center is a 9.5-inch square cut, which means I will need 9.5 inches for these sides. And I've cut the width at 5.5 inches, which means these squares will need to be 5.5-inch squares. So the first thing I need to do is sew that center block together. That centerpiece is now done. We're going to add on these corners. So in the pattern, it really looks like it's on an angle, but we're really sewing it straight until we get to those corners. The next row is going to be the same size as this square, and I'm going to continue that 5.5-inch mark. The next one will be this yellow. This yellow piece is that same size as that center piece. So that center was 9.5 inches. This is going to be 9.5 inches. And I'm keeping that same 5.5-inch measurement. So I have 9.5 inches by 5.5 inches. And I will need 4. These are those very straight pieces, which are very straightforward. But what we're needing to do is do these triangles all the way around. So this block will come a big square. So just like any quilt, the next thing we're going to do is the next round. So we'll put these aside. That was just to give you a visual on what we're looking at when it's larger. We can start and sew 2 ends onto that quilt. Now we get to start adding these setting triangles. The pattern piece has the strip width at 5.5 inches. And I do want to put a square in the corner and cut that square in half. But if I start with 5.5 inches, I do not have a seam allowance. So I recommend whatever this measurement is, you add 1 inch, and you can even add more. So this is 5.5 inches. I'm going to start with a 6.5-inch square. The square will be cut on the diagonal, but it's this edge that's going to be sewn onto those corners. I will be putting one on this edge and one on that edge. Now we can see that they are going to be a little bit too big, and that's what we're looking for. But I'm going to put some marks on these triangles. Whatever my strip width is, I'm going to transfer that mark onto those triangles. So from that corner over, I'm going to do a 5.5-inch mark. From this corner over, I'm going to do a 5.5-inch mark. Even though these two will match up, it just makes sure that I'm not stretching them. So on each end on the back, I have the 5.5-inch mark and a 5.5-inch mark, or whatever your strip is. And I'm going to match those edges and sew that 1/4 inch. And I need to do that on both sides. So we have two lines that match that piece. These two lines will go for the next stage. But keep in mind that we do need those triangles going in the same direction. So now those pieces will fit right along that edge. Those seams are going to match up, but when we turn it over, we have that additional seam that we drew that will match up to this edge. Because we did not know that exact corner, we are using this inside measurement that we drew. My seams are going to nestle up right to the other edge where that seam is going to match up. I have that on the one side, and I get to do that on the second side. When that seam has been stitched, when we open this up, we will notice that we have the same amount coming off of that edge. Now it's definitely more than a 1/4 inch, but we want that. And a special note is when you do mark that line, mark it right to the other end. These next rows will look like they're not going to fit. And that's because we're needing setting triangles on the ends of these pieces. We're going to be able to treat these all the same. And I need to put 2 setting triangles on each end. The pattern does have this 9.5 inches by 5.5 inches. So those squares are going to need to start at 6.5 inches. So we're looking at that piece right here that we need to put those triangles on. 6.5 inch squares, cut in half, and I'm going to draw those lines, just like I did in this setting triangle. Once those lines are marked, we can sew those pieces together. We now have this strip that's going to fit along this edge. Because I drew those full lines, I'm going to be able to trim right along that line. And that's going to clean up that edge. I can do that to all of the lines. When those 4 units are done, if we turn them over, we can see that top line and that side line. Draw in a 1/4 inch. So we're having 2 lines. That extra line is just giving me a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We can also trim off these little points, and we do have full lines that we're going to be able to use. And scissors will work just fine. With the dog ears trimmed off of the center block, we can now add those corners on. And I'm going to flip it over so you can see the back. If your seams were pressed in, when you go to match it up, this was the first seam that we drew, and that's that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's going to match up to this area here. If the seams were pressed in this direction, that original drawn line is going to match up along the edge of this fabric. So these 2 lines are going to give you 2 choices depending on how you press. One will match the raw edge of the fabric from that previous seam, or one will match the seam. And we don't need to worry about this. This was the first line we drew, and that was the second. With this done, we can really see it starting to take shape. We do have those generous setting triangles, which we're going to be able to trim down. But we do need to put the corners on to make this a square. And there are 2 different ways of doing it. The first way would be to take a square and cut it in half twice, which will mean this edge here is the edge is going to be sewn along here. So we need this measurement. In this miniature block, my measurement is 5 inches. We do need to consider seam allowances, and we are cutting twice, so add 1 inch. So we're going to do a 6 inch square and cut it in half twice And that edge will get stitched right along this edge. Now, if we don't want to use the block that's divided in 4, we can start with a square and just divide it in half. So this seam here through that center would be this seam here. So to get this measurement, the easiest way to get it is to pull this onto something square. So you have a square corner. It could be just a board, a cutting mat, a square ruler, but I'm going to just do it on this board. And I'm going to pull this block just until it gets to this corner. So this corner triangle would be the finished size. So I would have a square cut down the diagonal. We do need to take into consideration that seam allowance, so I can measure that and then add the inch. So for this little block, I need 3.5 inches. I'm going to cut 4.5 inches. This would be the preferred method because that way we do work with some straighter grains. If we use the method where we cut that twice, all of these edges are off grain. If you're following along with the big one, you can do that corner at a minimum of 7.5 inches. When we do go to sew this point on, and just by eye, you're going to be able to see that you have equal sides hanging over. And stitch that down. We can really see that square shape now. So this is just a miniature of the big one on the wall. We do need to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance from these points. So you can take a ruler and leave those marks right along that 1/4 inch. And if you have one point that's sort of tucked in and another point out, cut to the largest points. It's better to have the point and have a little extra fabric in here than to cut the point off. I'm going to cut off that extra. And now I have a 1/4 inch coming out from those points. And I'm going to do that all the way around. And that first edge I'm going to be able to use on a straight line on the ruler. I do want my 1/4 inch points. And if there's one that I can't see, I'm just going to mark it just to be sure. So the last cut is straight on a line. I have 1/4 inch coming out from those points. And cut. And I'm going to be able to continue cutting this all the way around. So I have 4 beautifully straight edges. By making those setting triangles a little bit bigger, it made it easy for us to trim them down. And even though by drawing lines on the triangles is another step, it does make it so we can line up those seam allowances. And it helps keep this straight and not stretched out of place. On that large one, I will be adding the rest of these borders, and I'll show you how it's going to turn out. The big quilt is now done. The center is the same. The only difference is the size. The triangles can be on biases and it can stretch. And by drawing those pretend seam allowances, make sure that we stay where we're supposed to stay so it doesn't get stretched out of shape. And then we have lots of room to trim up afterwards. Now the measurements that I was quoting throughout the video was for the big quilt, even though I did make the small one. But it does show you how well that system does work. I will put in the description the handout for this coloring sheet. Now the measurements that I have for my border might be slightly different than what you need because our seam allowances can be a little bit different than someone else's. But with this one, it won't matter. Just follow your sizes for those borders. It's a fun quilt to make because it's really just one huge block. So I do hope you enjoy my system for putting on those setting triangles. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're working on next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.